approach that's been used previously. Any tools or practices that we can build on earlier, the earlier practices are more likely to succeed and be used by people. Okay? So I have a scale here. See where it is. See one moment. Can anybody tell me what this is? No. It's a gas gauge, right? It's a gas gauge. A gas gauge is really kind of a rudimentary example of an outcome scale, right? An outcome scale is a continuum that describes, that describes the different states or conditions of status. So we know from our gas gauge, which will change over time, we have a full tank of gas. Okay? As we drive our vehicles, that changes. It goes down and down and down. So over time. We use outcome scales to measure incremental change over time. We keep an eye on our gas gauge because it's going to change. We need to make sure that we're not going to run out of gas, right? One of the interesting things we're going to practice here is we're going to go on a road trip, right? Let's do a road trip. I was going to go south, but it's really hot in this room, so I think we'll go north, okay? Because we need some fresh, cool air. So we're on the road trip, the kids are in the car, everybody's happy, we're singing songs, and off we go. And we're heading north where the air is cool and clean, and we can get some fresh air. Got a full tank of gas, all right? Off we go. Now we're driving. We've been on the road for a couple of hours. I look down. We're at 3/4 of a tank. What do we do? Should we pull over and get more gas? Or do we keep going? Keep going. Okay. So we continue. Kids are still singing. Everybody's laughing and having fun. Now, we're down to a half a tank of gas. What do we do? Do we pull over? Or do we keep going? Keep going. Okay. A couple hours later, everybody's still joyful, having a great time. The air is getting cooler. Now we're down to 1/4 of a tank. What do we do? How many people say keep going?
Non-stop church.
We have some risk takers in the room. How many people say pull over and get some gas? Ah, okay. All right. So, at one point, I'm hoping that obviously these terms are familiar to all of us, right? Thriving, safe, stable, vulnerable, and in crisis. This is an outcome scale. Does this align with our gas gauge, our very rudimentary scale? We have a full tank of gas. Are we thriving? Yeah. 3/4, does that align with being safe, would you say?
Yep.
Yeah. How about a half a tank of gas?
Yeah.
We're pretty stable, we're good. All right, now we're getting down into 1/4 of a tank of gas. That's what some of you said, keep going. Those are the risk takers. We're vulnerable now, right? We've got 1/4 of a tank of gas. We get back on the highway and we see a sign that says, next gas station, 200 miles.
And the red light.
And the red, yeah, and now we're saying, oh gee, I wish I had stopped for gas because now I'm vulnerable. I'm most likely to run out of gas. What happens when we run out of gas? We're in crisis. We're in trouble. This scale here, this thriving, safe, stable, vulnerable, and in-crisis scale is a 5-point scale that was developed by the CSBG Monitoring Task Force in the early 90s. We use it today, we're very familiar with it. And the interesting thing about this scale is that right here, this is called our prevention line. The prevention line is the line between being, dependent or independent, okay? There's a very fine line here. We know that any of our clients that come to us in crisis, very often, it's very costly measures that have to be taken to address the very critical conditions that they arrive to us in. It costs a lot. If we can make that difference, if we can catch people before we're in crisis, it's less costly. We run out of gas, we've got to call a tow truck. We've got to, if you pay for a tow. It costs a lot of money. So it's important to think of this as the prevention line. Keeping, people that are above this line are in a independent state, while those that fall below the prevention line are more in a dependent state. Now, we're going to do a little exercise. And keeping with our housing theme, we're going to begin to build a housing scale. Okay? So, what I want you to think about in this activity is doing some brainstorming about various kinds of conditions of housing. Okay, if you turn page 80 in your manual, you'll see the activity here. Consider all the ranges of possible ranges of all housing, both the best case and the worst case scenarios. The various types of housing conditions that we have in our community. Okay, and then what we will do is brainstorm that, and then we're going to try and match those conditions to our outcome scale. So take 5 minutes, think about the various types of housing conditions that we have in our community. If somebody is homeless living in a car, lives in a car, that's a housing condition, okay? Obviously, I think people would agree that that would fall in the in-crisis area, okay? So that's kind of what I'm getting at is think about all possible housing conditions and we'll match them on the scale. So take 5 minutes to do that.
Like homeless on the street. Lives in cars. That's the stuff. If it's Louisiana, they last winter, right after we did. She's just
She can be at one.
Okay.
Until age 26, probably. That's the number of partners. Subsidized housing.
Okay, how we doing? We coming up with some good housing conditions. Are we ready to move on? Do we need a few minutes? All right. Okay, so I'm just going to ask table 1 over here to just tell me what housing conditions did you come up with?
Owning your own home.
Owning your own home. All right. What else? What other housing? Owning your own home. That's a great one. Anybody else? Shout them out.
Living in shelter.
Living in shelter.
Living in a place not meant for habitation. Thank you very much.
Living in a place not meant for human habitation.
Living outside.
Living outside in a tent.
Does that kind of fall under?
Not meant for human habitation, or a little different? Okay. Living in housing where your rent is more than 30% of your income. Living in a place that has high housing code violations.
Subsidized housing.
Subsidized.
Back up, so did I hear basically unsafe housing?
Yeah, housing code violations.
No, sir.
Couch surfing and doubling up.
Subsidized estate.
No.
Who does that?
Living in an apartment where you're able to pay your rent.
So renting or owning?
Purified water.
Oh, rent. Rent, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I heard hotel. Okay. Anybody else? Any other housing conditions?
Living in foreclosure.
Living in foreclosure.
Domestic violence situations.
Domestic violence situations.
How, kind of housing?
Susan, did you mean in like a domestic violence shelter? Or how is that tied to housing?
No, I'm speaking more someone who's living in that situation and comes to us in crisis and needs alternative situations.
Okay. So an alternative to domestic violence, getting out of that housing situation and into a better, safe place, okay?
Staying with relatives.
Staying with relatives.
Bill, are you saying something about your
Do you know anything about that?
I'm not staying with relatives, I'm not paying rent.
That sounds like you're driving to me. How about living in a McMansion, like a Tom Brady house? Something fancy.
How about
Very.
Live in one of your buses?
What?
Owning 5 homes and not having options for which home you want to live
So when we talk about owning our own home, are we talking about, do we have a mortgage or are we totally paid off? Maybe those are two different,
in. Yeah, when you're paid off, when you're not.
with versus without.
How about about public housing? I don't know if we mentioned that one.
I thought I heard subsidized for
Oh,
all,
okay, yeah, good.
think we have eviction.
so facing
Oh,
eviction.
yep. Somebody facing eviction. Okay, we got quite a good list going here. So what I'm going to do is
That's right, prison.
prison. Oh.
Institutional settings, yeah.
Institutional settings.
So we'll just kind of group that together because we're out of room, so maybe that could also include hospitalization, that kind of thing.
All right, I'm just going to take this right off so we can see it. Now our job, the second part of our activity, is to try and match some of these housing conditions onto our scale. Okay? So we said owning your own home with or without a mortgage. People would put that as thriving. Okay. How about living in a shelter? Some say vulnerable and some say in crisis.
I don't know, it's one of Carl's shelters. We know
Carl, what's the answer?
Well, you know,
That's what the assessments say.
again, it's important to, you know, go through this exercise because we have to set the standard that everyone uses. So if we say that living in shelter means is in crisis, then we have to accept that. We have to reach consensus, accept it, and use it agency-wide, okay? Because that's going to be really important as we move forward in this exercise. But so Carl and Solange feel that living in shelter means in crisis, and they are the housing experts, the residential experts. So I say we go with them. An apartment where we can afford the rent. That would be safe. Okay, what do you think? Safe?
You don't think that's
Yeah, but most of that is not affording the rent in the market today. You might be affording the rent because you don't want to buy a house.
Right.
There's so many people that want to buy a house. I think that's, I'm arguing.
But I would say the difference between those two is that even if you're choosing to pay rent, you're still not investing in something that will pay off.
And it could, I disagree that doesn't necessarily mean you're only safe.
I would say safe only because you can't control what happens to your unit. So your landlord could tomorrow decide to sell the apartment building and now
Your situation could change, it's out of your
Affording it
control.
means that you're making it, not that you're able to like do more than that. Thriving is being able to do more than what you actually do.
We're not, okay, we're not discussion on this.
I don't care. I'm telling you, I'm gonna disagree.
You can disagree.
Because I know lots of people that live in apartments in Boston and they love it. Yeah, thriving.
Okay. All right, so who says, yeah, but in this instance, majority rules. Who says thriving? Who says safe? The safe has it.
Way up here, right by the line.
Yeah, it's up there. That's right. Okay, outside in a tent. Right?
Some people choose to live in tents.
This is messed up.
Places not meant for human habitation.
Crisis.
I think I skipped a couple. How about subsidized or public housing? Stable. I just want to point out, you know, there are, a lot of these are based on our community, where we place things. Remember, these benchmarks are defined by our community. For instance, public housing. In some communities, they're very well managed, they're safe, they're clean, and they create this positive sense of community, okay? So we might say, okay, somebody living in public housing might be placed in the stable of the safe benchmark. Other communities the public housing may not be so safe. There may be high crime, they may be in disrepair, so we might place that on the vulnerable benchmark or even the in crisis. But again, just keep that in mind, that it's based on community, these benchmarks. We have to decide what they mean to our community.
I feel like it's based on the person too. If you're living in a shelter and then you go into like a, 6-month situation, it's feeling pretty stable even though it's not.
That's right.
You gotta look at it from an environmental perspective versus what we say is.
Exactly. You do need to do that, and you need to keep that in mind when you're talking about, client stability.
And you can have a person in our family that receives subsidized housing and just based on all their service, they're thriving and they're doing very well and succeeding in a lot of different things. Then you have the other family who has like no income and stuff like that, and it's really like even though they have subsidized housing, are still struggling to like feed their kids and clothe themselves. So you can see them as still being vulnerable or in crisis. So it's it's safe. I think it's very subjective. Yeah.
It's more like a matrix.
That's right, it is.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to finish this up here. Let's say facing eviction.
Vulnerable.
Vulnerable.
Crisis.
Housing, where the rent is greater than 30% of your income. Vulnerable.
I say stable.
Some say stable, some say vulnerable.
Here, it pays less than some for their mortgage or rent. So, that's what it's all.
30% of your expenses.
So you can see how this, as we go through the exercise, how, there's a fine line. And it's up to us to define what these benchmarks mean. Because if we're really going to watch people over a continuum of time on an outcome scale, the point of this is to see how they progress over time and what changes occur. Our baseline, our placement on that baseline needs to be accurate. It needs to be something that we all agree on, and it does not change. So the benchmarks have to be defined by what our community tells us. Bill?
But there are other factors.
Right.
Like resources, money, family,
Right.
whatever, that affect whether or not it's stable or vulnerable.
That's right. So sometimes in these outcome areas, we have owning a home. We had one, I think it was a renter, can afford the rent. Chris felt that that was thriving, and everybody else felt that that was safe. Sometimes, just keep in mind that a client can only be at one point at one place of the scale at a time, all right? So we may have different outcomes within each of these benchmarks that are kind of graded based on other conditions, like you said, Bill. There's other factors that come into play. So, they may still fall within the stable or the safe benchmark, but in a different level.
Can I add something real quick?
Yep.
Just that when we're looking at this particular example, we're talking about specifically their status related to housing.
Right.
But then a little later on, when you build an outcomes matrix, you look at some of these different factors that come into play so that you're looking at multiple outcomes across multiple conditions
Exactly,
together.
so if your only expense was 30% of your income was your rent, you're in good shape. But for most people, your only expense isn't just your rent, that's more than 30% of your income. So it's really gonna depend on the person, what
right. So we've got some outcomes that are in each of these categories, each of these benchmarks, okay? These kinds of things have been used for decades to, measure incremental change over time. They also help us visualize the bigger picture, that's facing the client at our first meeting, When do we ask, when do we find out, or how do we find out what condition a client is in? Anybody have an idea about that? How do we know? At intake, we ask them. We don't ask them, where would you say you fall on the scale? we definitely don't do that. But what we do is we say, can you please describe your current situation? What's going on in your life? And it's often done at intake. Our first assessment of a client is often done at intake. That's where the first establishment of the baseline is key for any subsequent follow-up or measurement over time. We need to make sure that that baseline is clearly established in a standardized way in order to support, moving forward. Different caseworkers may do follow-up placement. They may have a different understanding of the family's condition. Therefore, it's extremely important that the relationship between the first and second placement is it's reliable. We have to have consistency in standards. So we've created this outcome scale. What I want to do now is talk about an outcome matrix, okay? I know it's hysterical. Outcome matrices are really just a grouping, if you will, of an outcome scale, side by side each other, okay? And there's different characteristics of an outcome matrix, okay? But what they basically do is they help us visualize where the client is in terms of, that prevention line we talked about right here, between being dependent and independent, okay? So, if a caseworker decides that, at intake that a client is stable or safe, we know that they're above the prevention line. And maybe in different areas, we will look at that more closely and say, okay, they're above the prevention line in our education indicator or our employment indicator, and below the prevention line in our housing situation, okay, our housing indicators, or some other indicator that we choose to measure. So we want to focus our attention on particularly those that are below the prevention line. That's when we need to do some intervention work, like when we were taking our road trip. We had to make a decision as to when we would intervene and actually stop and get gas for the car, right? Some people are risk takers, I know that. But, so, a sample outcome matrix, okay? So I want you to turn to page 93 in your book. Okay? This is a sample outcome matrix, okay? It has, across the top, you will see the various domains. We have 6 of them. We have income, employment, housing, education and training, transportation, and childcare. Okay? Those are the various dimensions that we're going to be measuring in our outcome scale, our outcome matrix. Again, we want to make sure that the placement, that initial placement that occurs is agreed upon, and we all have reached consensus, and we all have a clear definition of what that is. Okay? So when we look at this outcome assessment, outcome matrix, can anybody tell me, under the income domain, all right, when was the first assessment done? Do we know?
February 1st.
On February 1st, that's right. And on February 1st, this client came to us and we discovered that their income is between 50 and 100% of the poverty level by their family size. That was placed in the in-crisis benchmark area because we determined that that's where that belongs, okay? Then, our next assessment of income, under the income domain, when was that done? Can you see it? May 1st. What happened? It went up. The client is doing a little bit better. Apparently their income has increased a little bit over that initial placement. 3 months later, they're doing a little better. They got a little bit better job and they moved up. They're still vulnerable because they fall between 100 and 125% of the poverty level for their family size. That was what we decided was vulnerable, okay? And then what happened in the next assessment? 3 months later, we did another assessment under the income of this client. It was done on August 1st. Do you see that? They went up. They went up again. So you can see that now they're up to stable under the income domain. They're between 126 to 175% of the poverty level for their family size. So that is the progression as we look and analyze this, family outcome matrix. You can see the various stages at which we measure that incremental change over time. Again, if we took one domain, it would be an outcome scale. But when we take multiple domains and line them up against each other, it becomes an outcome matrix. And that really tells us a lot. Our prevention line, again, is between vulnerable and stable. So perhaps we might think that a lot of our interventions would take place for all of those domains that are under the prevention line. Okay, that's where we'll focus our energies in moving folks up. So
Peggy, in this person's case, the only thing that really made a difference in their life, they didn't get any more training, but they got childcare that then allowed them to work full-time.
that's right. That made all the difference. That made all the difference, the child care. It moved the furthest. And it could be that due to those special circumstances, related to employer-provided child care or other specific situations that we don't necessarily know, but that made all the difference. Is there anything else you see in this outcome matrix that stands out? So again, it looks like perhaps if we look at the employment, that full-time employment for this family resulted in a significant increase in their income. Okay, so it began to get a much bigger, fuller picture of the clients that we're serving by measuring them on an outcome matrix. Okay? Anybody have any questions about that? All right, I'm going to just simply review the key points that we talked about. An outcome scale is a continuum that describes different states or conditions of status. Scales are used to measure incremental change over time. Any movement in a positive direction on the outcome scale is considered movement towards self-sufficiency, even if the movement is from in crisis to vulnerable. There is significant differences in outcomes placed in the vulnerable benchmark and the stable benchmark. Movement from vulnerable to stable is that transition between dependency and independence. Outcome scales can be aggregated to form an outcome matrix, and it is the individual benchmark on the outcome scale that are reportable outcomes. If the benchmark on the outcome scale are written in outcome language, they are reportable. It's not appropriate, that's one thing I want to say, is sometimes in our world, we may say, oh, a client moved from vulnerable to stable, or they moved up one level, and that's how we'll describe their condition. That really doesn't tell us anything. We want to, if we really do this in outcome language, we'll say that this family moved up that was facing eviction or couldn't afford the rent. Now they're in subsidized housing or public housing with a roof over their head. Or now they've gone from here to an apartment that they can afford. That's how we want to talk about these benchmarks in outcome language. So an outcome matrix is simply a series of those same scales arranged side by side. It's used to capture a client's progress and those incremental changes over time. We do those assessments generally at intake, that initial assessment where they're placed on the scale, and then periodically we decide, is it 3 months, is it 6 months, and we keep measuring over time. The whole point is to deliver results that reach a level of self-sufficiency. It also provides